Hello, everyone, and thank you so very much for joining UNICEF Canada, McGill University, and the Canadian Wellbeing Knowledges Network. We're co-hosting this discussion about child-sensitive budgeting. The session is being recorded, and it's also available in French through the interpretation button on your Zoom menu. I'm Lisa Wolfe, the Director of Policy and Research at UNICEF Canada, and I'm your moderator today. I'm joining you from the territory of the Chippewa First Nations of Lake Simcoe and Mississauga First Nations on the north shore of Lake Ontario in the jurisdiction of the Williams Treaty. For me, our discussion is an opportunity to reflect on treaty responsibilities to steward not only the natural and cultural resources of these lands, but also to ensure economic resources are equitably shared with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children and communities. Child-sensitive budgeting is a really timely discussion for our Canadian participants today, as it follows tabling of the most recent federal budget, a number of provincial budgets, and a historic financial settlement agreement pursuant to discrimination against Indigenous children. Public budgets are one of the fundamental functions of government, and all of the rights children have can be affected by public budgets. They have a significant bearing on which rights are realized, to what extent, and for whom. So public budgets are central to every state's obligations to fulfill children's rights. In fact, states have an obligation to invest their fiscal resources in children to the maximum extent possible. Our central question today is, how do we know if they do? Today, you're going to learn about some of the 14 tools in the UNICEF Public Finance for Children Toolkit, and hear about examples about how countries around the world are using them to account for how much money is spent on children in public systems and on what to achieve better and more equitable outcomes for children. In other words, we're concerned about the size, composition, and results of public investment in children. Many of the examples you're going to hear about are in low and middle income countries where fiscal space or resources and spending bottlenecks are significant challenges. But rich countries share the obligation to make children visible in their budgets and to give them priority in spending. In many rich countries, the visibility of children in public budgets is obscure to all but the most ardent economists and auditors. And for many children in rich countries, public spending to meet their needs is far too little and invested too late in childhood. It can also be incoherent and regressive, creating gaps that perpetuate inequities across children's lives. In some of our countries, national wealth has risen steadily for decades, while children's outcomes ranked in UNICEF report cards have fallen, which begs the question, where are the dividends for children? In 2022, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child asked all levels of government in Canada, as they do in many countries, to advance child-sensitive budgeting by implementing a tracking system for the allocation of resources to children throughout the budget and assessing how investments serve the best interests of children, with special attention to ensure substantive equity for Indigenous and racialized children, children with disabilities, and those excluded by other equity fault lines. So we're going to hear today about how UK governments are responding to similar recommendations. And there are two directions of change in how budgets are being developed in Canada and in a number of other countries that really present opportunities to take up these recommendations. Federal budgets in Canada have begun to identify which allocations are intended to benefit different groups of people according to gender, as well as income, age, and other equity fault lines. And governments across Canada and in countries like New Zealand and Scotland are articulating well-being budgets, which align expenditures to quality of life indicators. Giving children specific visibility in these kinds of initiatives is an opportunity to strengthen the link between public investments and results for children. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to hear from my UNICEF colleagues about the principles, practices, and possibilities to get this done. And then for the last 30 minutes or so, I'll facilitate a discussion with our presenters to hear your questions, address any comments you may have. Please post these in the chat. And now I'd like to welcome Natalia Winder-Rossi, who's the Director of Social Policy and Social Protection based in UNICEF headquarters. and Dominic Richardson, the Chief Social and Economic Analysis of the UNICEF in Ashanti Global Office of Research and Foresight. Over to you, Natalia.
Good morning, afternoon to everybody. Many thanks to UNICEF Canada, to McGill University, to the Canadian Wellbeing Knowledges Network for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here to share UNICEF's approach and priorities around public finance for children. I'm delighted to be sharing this presentation with Dom, our partner and our Chief of Social and Economic Analysis. So we're going to do a two-person show. UNICEF work in public finance for children is of course driven by a rights-based approach. It's very much enshrined by the Convention of the Rights of the Child and a very specific article and general comment that has a very strong call on the need for governments to really, as duty bearers, ensure that that the rights of the child are being realized and there is the adequate financing to make sure that that's happening. And I think this is a very important call to understand that it's not just about the right to a specific area of work and impacts, but also having a very strong commitment from governments that they need to create the most effective enabling environment and have a specific budget lines and making sure that those investments are realized to really transform ideas, concepts, plans, action plans to budget lines that can then create specific results across sectors. We also have, of course, a very strong alignment with key SDGs that are also calling for stronger investment and leveraging of domestic financing. So the two indicators that we are closely following in our strategic plan are looking very much on equity of spending, but also on the proportion of critical spending across social sectors, which we believe make a huge difference in terms of children's lives. And that is, of course, contributing to broader indicators across the board. I think it was important for us to also make the very strong case that, of course, even though our main driver is a human rights-based approach, we also have been working very, very diligently in creating a very strong investment case. The interrelation between, you know, a rights-based approach and the impacts, the economic impacts, the investment impacts that having a very strong spending around social sectors and children have. And even though those investment cases are context specific and, you know, we have to be very, very, very careful on those numbers, there is a case that when you invest in children, you invest in early years, you definitely see the impact coming immediately in terms of well-being, but also in an overall multiplier effect in economies, in inclusive growth, and in, as I said at the beginning, on the strengthening of the social contract. And even though this investment case for many of us is clear and it's very well documented, the coverage and the type of investments that we see across the board, across different country contexts is still not enough. Not enough in terms of adequacy. There's massive financing shortfalls across all social sectors. And now we did a recent analysis that also showed that the climate crisis is posing additional costs across different social sectors. And many of the discussions that we're having in the international forum around climate financing and prioritizing climate investment is not necessarily taking into account those extra costs that social sectors need to be able to become more resilient and more prepared are more able to respond to the needs of the climate crisis. So for example, social protection systems, which have been proven to provide critical support to address some of the impacts of climate risk, are not necessarily always well prepared and well financed to be able to respond or to have the critical linkages with early warning or critical indicators in that regard. So we still have a big gap in terms of the adequacy of investment across different sectors. There's also gaps in terms of equity. Major inequalities within countries, major inequalities on where the best or the most efficient resources are going. For example, in terms of education, a lot of the resources are in many countries are going to support higher education and not necessarily basic or early childhood education, making a huge disparity of who is receiving those resources and the impact that you're going to have in terms of well-being and in terms of children's impact. Also in terms of efficiency, even if on paper we see that governments at national and subnational level have allocated important resources to different sectors, the absorption capacity in some contexts remains very limited. The capacity to manage resources, to plan, and to be able to use effectively those resources remains a key constraint in many contexts. And that reduces progressively the legitimacy of many social sectors to continue to ask for more resources in subsequent years. And makes a very difficult case to continue to receive resources across the board. And maybe lastly, in terms of prioritization, it's very, unfortunately, social sectors are usually the first to be targeted when there are economic constraints. And in many contexts, and also we did a review of this under last year, that in many cases, most countries are spending more of their resources in debt servicing than on education, health, and social protection combined. So I think this is a very important case to be made. We do have a very strong rights-based approach. We do have a very strong investment case, but still major gaps in terms of the volume, the adequacy, the equity, the efficiency, and the prioritization of investments for children and social sectors. In this context, the work that we've been prioritizing in UNICEF around public finance for children tries to respond to those key objectives and tries to provide our technical expertise and long-standing field presence to work hand in hand with governments at national and at subnational level to enhance the adequacy of resources. So for instance, supporting evidence generation, data collection that really can help to have an evidence-based advocacy for greater and better public investments for children, helping governments to make their budgets more efficient, and enhancing the capacity for timely disbursement and reduction of leakages, and really engage with different line ministries and budget processes to really support the best way to allocate resources, to prioritize, and to make the most efficient use of resources, responding to the different needs of children across the life cycle. Work around results-based budgeting and value for money approaches for more effective spending also for children, and making sure that we can help with the right prioritization and the right approach in terms of effective use of resources. Help governments to have a much more equitable spending with greater attention to disadvantaged groups, but also within sectors of those sectors and those parts of the investment that can have a much more efficient impact across the board. And also enhancing the way that spending is used, monitored, and enhancing the capacity of children, adolescents, and communities at large to have a stronger role around accountability. And I think it's a very important element of the work on trying to enhance the capacity of governments, but also empower citizens and communities to be better able to track, to monitor, and to effectively participate in national, local, and local budgeting processes, not only from an input and consultation perspective, but from a co-creation and shaping. And we've seen a lot of really critical examples where that participation has definitely enhanced the quality and the impact of critical investments for children. And this is a bit of a visual to show that this is work that we do across the different elements of the project cycle, looking at the different dimensions, not only the technical elements of planning and budget allocation and expenditure, but also looking at the political economy of allocations, looking at how to better help governments with the better timing. Where is the best time to provide evidence and advocacy to influence a specific budget allocation or planning process? What are the key policies that need to be reformed and need to be enhanced? And how can we provide a better support to line ministries to enhance, as I said at the beginning, their credibility vis-a-vis ministers of finance? And it's an overarching, if you want, and continuous approach across the different pieces of the cycle, looking at the end to really make sure that we're enhancing children's outcomes at scale. I think the current context that we're in, which we're all, I think, very aware of, have further, I think, enhanced the relevance and urgency of this agenda. We have what we've been calling a polycrisis context, which we've seen and an increase in child poverty, as I mentioned at the beginning, as a result of the pandemic, of climate, of conflict. And this is not only an issue in terms of the number. We calculate around an additional 100 million more children living in poverty as a result of the CCC. But it's also a change in the profile of children living in poverty, meaning children that had not experienced poverty before, children that were able to move out of poverty have now fallen back. And this is a challenge not only for low income countries. This is a key issue for middle income and high income countries also. And we've seen, the big impact, for example, of the Ukraine war in terms of food and nutrition crisis, in terms of increase of inflation, and an increase in poverty also in many high income countries. The context is also a context that has further exacerbated the SDG financing gap. We've seen that even before COVID, we had a major gap in terms of particular social sectors and financing of social related SDGs. And now, given the economic constraints, once again we see the risk of potential austerity measures and the impact of cutting social sector spending across the board. And two more elements that are starting to become a bigger issue, the potential risk of a debt crisis, that the volatility of the current debt infrastructure, and how that is also further challenging the ability of countries to prioritize investments in social sectors and children. And the limited alignment of the discussions that we're having at global level of the different sources of funding that we can tap in terms of climate financing, humanitarian financing, and development financing. Currently, we have different strands that are really focusing on the importance of these three elements and the need to enhance and expand financing for development, for humanitarian purposes, or for climate. But they're still not coming together in understanding that in the current context, we do need a much more coordinated approach, looking at preparedness, at resilience, and as a continuum of approaches around development and humanitarian context. And this is just, to re-emphasize the urgency and the enhanced relevance that we see in UNICEF of really leveraging public finance. The critical importance to continue to protect social spending, even in context of economic crises. Children's budget should be the last to be cut and the first to be protected of expanding. But also understanding that we're asking many governments to do more and better with the same fiscal space, and therefore also the need to help them to identify new financing mechanisms, new ways of enhancing efficiencies and freeing fiscal space to really address critical gaps and scale up innovation in key areas of work, such as care economy, such as social protection, such as resilient social systems, among other elements. I wanted to also share just one of the latest analysis that was done under Dominic's leadership on some of the very specific numbers that we've seen in the increase of child poverty across Europe and Central Asia, for instance, as a result of the Ukraine crisis, just to make a very strong case that child poverty is not an issue just for low-income countries, but it's very much a challenge across the board, including in high-income countries, and the impacts that it has on immediate gaps in terms of economic access, but also what the multiplier effects in terms of health, in terms of learning losses, in terms of their potential access to employment at a later stage, and the extent to which right now it's very important to continue focusing on expanding social protection, on expanding family-friendly policies, and very critically protecting social spending, particularly for children in vulnerable situations. I think as UNICEF, we've been working in this agenda for many years, trying to really bring a very strong focus on the linkages between child rights and the investment case on investing in children, on the importance and the opportunity that governments have in also showing their commitment to the CRC through their budgets and through their budget allocations, being very close and leveraging our field experience and country presence to work very closely with governments at national and subnational levels to enhance, as I said, their capacities to budget better, to plan better, to prioritize better, but also making sure that they have the most efficient use of resources that can support and have a better impact across the board. The advantage of being to work in not just one sector, but in most of the social sectors also allow us to provide a little more of a nuanced knowledge of the sectors, working hand in hand with the line ministries, and therefore helping them to go to ministers of finance, not to just say we need more money, but this is the cost, this is the added value, this is the impact of our investment, and this is how we've been using our resources the last year in a very transparent way, and therefore we need more support to continue to leverage those results. And I think that has been a very nuanced and specific support that has helped to really leverage key resources and key changes at policy level across the board. Very key element of our work, and I was mentioning throughout the slides, the work of UNICEF with partners is not just around the national level allocation of resources, although that's a big part, but also working at subnational and local level. We know the local governments are usually the main providers of social services for children, and particularly in federal and decentralized context, which is a norm in many regions, that supporting the allocation and the use of social spending is critical. So we try to really understand those territorial characteristics, the capacity, the structural disparities, helping again to enhance capacity of planning and budgeting of local governments, their absorption capacity, and as I said at the beginning, to enhance the different structures that exist to enhance the effective participation of children, adolescents, and communities in budget prioritization, use, and accountability. There's many challenges across the centralized public finance, but I think is where we can make a big result and a big impact at scale if we start with those very local level elements of work. And I know there's a lot of experience in Canada across this area of work. I hope that you can use the presentation also as a reference and to go back to go into detail into some examples. I've included some of the key ones that we thought were interesting or maybe interesting for you to take a look and learn from, and we are happy to maybe have more discussions and bring some of our country colleagues to go into in depth of some of those processes. But so I've included an example of Oman, I've included an example of Argentina and others. I would like to maybe focus on a couple. One is the work that we have been doing in Argentina, led by our country office, where I think it was very critical on how the timely use of very specific data was able to really make a difference in how the budget was prioritized, and making the different support from data analyses, making sure that there's a consistent way of monitoring child poverty, but also of what is the best way of using a child lens across the budget cycle, having very specific and age-specific budget analyses, and using that data to have a strong advocacy and presentation, evidence-based presentation, in this case, in the Commission of Family, Childhood, and Youth of Chambers of Deputies, as part of the budget preparation, sort of very specific and strategic moment of discussion, with very strong media coverage and advocacy on the gaps that there were, but also on the importance and the impact that changing and enhancing the child lens of the budget process would have in terms of children, but also in terms of the overall economic growth of the country. And that helped to then have a very critical and specific expansion of the budget, looking at more resources for children and adolescents, which was a 9% increase of the original budget that was considered for this area. Similarly, for instance, the work that we did in Tunisia around the financing a universal child benefit, where the work of UNICEF conducting a feasibility study on the more cost-effective and equitable approaches of a child benefit versus full subsidies, and having very concrete, specific, and solid evidence on comparing, let's say, the two potential policies and the results around effectiveness and equity, working hand in hand with IFIs, with the bank, with IMF, with the Ministry of Finance, and use that work to also conduct an additional fiscal analysis. We'd also recommended the cost. So it's not just this is more equitable and effective, but it's also it's affordable, and there is a way of really finance this with domestic resources, and bringing that together again in a very specific strategic moment in a discussion of a law that then was able to materialize in the institutionalization of a monthly benefit for all children under 5 who are now registered in social assistance schemes. And I think this is the kind of work that sometimes is not very, very visible, but that is creating a very impactful and critical results for the life of many children. Using effective data, using solid evidence, leveraging partnerships, leveraging critical data, critical moments of time, working very closely with ministries of finance and line ministries, and really creating and changing the way that domestic financing is allocated for kinds of results as the ones that we saw in Tunisia and in others. I mean, there's many examples that I've included in this slides. Maybe the last one that I will focus on is the example in Ghana, which again, in a context of economic contraction, the first sectors that were starting to be at risk were the social sectors and the social protection investment, even though it's been a program that has been existent for many years with very critical results and very solid evidence. Usually, you know, the first reaction in many governments is to cut social spending when there is an economic contraction. UNICEF was able to not only provide very critical budget briefs on the expenditure and the outcomes of the program, being very clear around this is how resources have been used and the impacts that the government has been able to yield as a result of the program, but also leverage the expertise of the IMF and the bank to be able to ring fence social spending in the context of fiscal strengthening. And this was critical to make sure that as part of the stimulus packages that were provided during COVID-19, there was an alignment in the approach around the UN, IMF, and the bank, and it was allowed to therefore expand the coverage and the support of social protection for many Ghanaians in that context. There's many examples. I will work across many different contexts and really rich evidence on the work that we're doing. Invite you to check our different resources and publications where we try to not only provide examples of work, but also critical tools that could be useful for your work in terms of, you know, learning more about what do we mean by public finance for children, why is it important, very specific program briefs on the different elements and different stages of the finance project cycle and how to better integrate a child lens around it, as well as a series of what we call the social spending monitor policy briefs that looks at very critical elements around social spending, such as the impact on debt, the impact on climate, elements of equity and adequacy. So I've included in the presentation for reference the links and the different documents and reference that could be helpful for all of you. So I'm going to stop here and hand over to Dominic. Dom, over to you.
Great, thanks, Natalia. Whilst people are taking in your key messages, I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to speak about some work we're about to publish on not just how much money is spent on children in different countries around the world, but how it's spent and when it's spent, and how coherent that is in terms of the evidence base about when we need to have certain types of services or cash interventions for the promotion of children's rights and well-being. If you could click to the next slide, please, Natalia. We're publishing a study called Too Little, Too Late. If some of you may know the work that I did with OECD on doing better for children or doing better for families, those studies included what we called age spending profiles. So they took the information on how much the government was spending and the information on how they were spending it through their reported policy descriptions. And we allocated it to an indicative average child in the population to see how well the spending profile reflected, first of all, Heckman's slope of early investment, prioritizing early investment for the benefit not only of the child, but for the optimization of public finance for children. to test that, and also to see how well it aligned to what we understood about other information on child well-being and development, and critical and sensitive points in the life course, such as when a child is born, or when immunizations are needed, or when a child leaves school, and so on. And looking across these 84 countries, these are the key messages. There's no consistency, even amongst high-income countries, on how to manage a portfolio of child and family policies, where to put the money and when to put the money. Best evidence from the literature is not followed, and the data globally is incomplete. There are more than 100 countries worldwide where we don't know how and when money is spent on children, because we're not consistent in collecting the information and harmonizing it to compare budgets well. I noticed Adriana's comment in the chat. Absolutely right. Very difficult, and only a handful of countries, well, about 84, are getting this right. The evidence that we've put together shows chronic underinvestment in children, particularly through social protection, which is the mainstay of the early interventions. We're talking about birth grants, maternity and parental leave policies, maybe home care allowances, childcare services, universal or means-tested child benefits. Yeah, mainly things that fall under social services, social protection, even though they can be managed in different ministries, maybe social development ministry, sometimes health and welfare, sometimes education. When we look at the poorest countries and we compare how much is spent per head using US dollars PPP, we find that if a child doesn't go to school in an average low income country, between the ages of 0 and 17, they'll receive less than $3,000 of public investment. And if the child, through the period when the child is under the age of 6, it's less than 7% of that $3,000. That's already contrary to the best evidence. When we look at high-income countries, and I'll show you some numbers on that spending later. But whilst the spending in low-income countries is stagnating, and we're heading towards a second debt crisis in recent years, there's pressures on foreign assistance and the mobilization of domestic resources in low and middle-income countries. Prior to COVID, OECD countries were showing an increase in their average spending on children and families. And interestingly, a trend towards services, which shows that childcare services and human services are a more popular form of investment than cash on the under sixes, and the spending is around about 28–29% of the total child budget. I mentioned Natalia mentioned the poly crisis, and we expect that to put pressures not dissimilar to the global financial crisis on what's happening for children right now. We'll go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So why do we need to understand how and when and how money is spent on children? If you go to the next slide, we all understand the importance, the consensus on the importance of early investment. We did a study called What Makes Me. It builds on top of the types of studies you've seen from Heckman and many others, looking at early investments and the returns, not just the immediate well-being returns, but the longer-term returns through child development, but also through labor market attachment, improvements in gender equality, and so on. Our study looks specifically at human skills development, the things, the bones of sort of human interaction. Things basically like listening, including spatial listening, empathizing, inquiring. And those three particular skills were developed, malleable, and measurable before children were able to talk, and before age 1. Discerning patterns, the ability to associate things that they see, observing, reflecting, relaxing, sensing, generally things that would help learning and engagement and play. They were all malleable, measurable before the age of 4. It's after that there's fluency in these skills, giving us the indication that setting down the foundation for child development really happens in the very early years, and maintaining that is the business of policies or at least the big wheels of policy in later life. Could you click on? Thanks. We also know that spending on children is critical for inclusive development and understanding when and how to spend. There's no human development without child development. If you manage to impress a change on the SDGs but still leave children behind, your human development goals will be short-lived. We have to start from the ground up. But what we're seeing, but these profiles are showing us growing a path only for growth and inequality both within and between countries. Knowing when and how money is spent helps us with the demand for greater effectiveness and efficiency. If budgets are tight, we need to spend smarter. If you don't spend a penny on a child until they get to school, the expenditures in school will be suboptimal. It doesn't mean the child won't benefit, but they would have benefited a lot better if they weren't left, in some cases, for their conditions to worsen or stagnate in terms of development prior to the school years. And as I say, these at the individual level and at the macro level, these are critical for the achievement of our social development goals. This understanding. So we've looked at age-related expenditure profiles in 84 countries. As I said, we've used the World Bank Aspire expenditures and the social security programs throughout the world work, which is managed by ILO. The Manchester University Social Assistance Explorer, education statistics from UIS, OECD sources too. The World Bank Data Bank helps us standardize our information using population, GDP, national currency units, and so on. We've only looked at public spending, not private. Companies and parents don't sign the UNCRC, governments do. And it's governments that are committed to those achievements. So we're looking at what governments do. Local spending is always underestimated. Those of you from Canada will know the difficulties with the devolution of fiscal responsibilities often means challenges with reporting aggregates. We don't include health spending, but we do look at it in the study and estimate what effect it would have. Obviously, spending doesn't measure service quality, and spending amounts don't measure take-up. Averages hide detail in child need. What would be different if the child was disabled or if the child was from a very poor household? And we rely on a few assumptions. Generally, as always, high-income countries have better data. Unfortunately for Canada, as you'll see, we couldn't do the work because you don't report expenditure statistics to the OECD, education expenditure statistics to the OECD. So let's click on it, please. So if we were to look at age spending, this where we understand it in three different ways. An equal distribution by age. So every child, whether they're 1, 7, 13, 19, would get the same amount, and it would look like that. Could you click again? Or we'd hope the country understands Heckman's propositions and the evidence base on early intervention, and the spending profile should look like this, with higher spending early on, and it tapers down as efficiencies come in. And it's also true to sort of basic human development. We click on again. Or if countries consider investing in education and particularly institutional capital, qualifications, and they put money in the period prior to a child leaving school, invest in this order, this is a backloaded expenditure, and you'll see it goes up as children get older. This is not what Heckman would say is a good idea, or others, and it doesn't really suit what we understand about child development, well-being, and so on. And it also has risks to the achievement of rights, because there's inequalities in the distribution of public expenditure by age. So I wanted to look at a few expenditure figures. We'll look at some countries in a minute, but this is the general findings. If you live in a low-income country, if you're born in a low-income country or conceived in a low-income country, it's better to say, by the time you're 18, you'll receive about $11,000 on average. This is purchasing power parity, so purchasing the same things. So you can compare across income brackets. And it's just 2.3 thousand if the child doesn't go to school, and 6.7 going to the under sixes. We've mentioned that. In low and middle income countries, the spending is higher, 18,000 per child, about 1,000 a year. If the child doesn't go to school, they receive a bit more, about 13.6. But still, the investment on the early years, which should be a third if you think about it, 6 years, 6 years, 6 years, is just 8.2% of total on the average child. Upper middle income countries, now 4 times the amount of a low income country. There's less of a reliance on attending a compulsory school to get access to these funds. There's more social protection, more human services in the picture, but still just 11% of total goes to the youngest children in the population. Now, the OECD countries are spending almost 20 times in purchasing power parities in a low-income country on the average child. And it's not very different if they attend school or not, because most children do. And it's almost up to a third. And it's increased recently, as I say, to about 29%. If we click on to the next slide. This is just the family expenditures. You get this from the OECD database. They reported it just this year. This is 2019 data. This is the total expenditure before we split it up by age. You can see France, Sweden, Norway, they're high spenders, over 3%, Germany, over 3%. Just click once. We'll see an arrow that'll point out where Canada is. A couple of interesting things to point out in this chart. Despite Canada being spending less, and we're not looking at education here, but the other parts, spending less than the OECD on average and comparators in the EU, Canada is a high cash spender, even in comparison to France, Sweden, Norway, Germany, and the EU as a whole. Much less expenditure on care services and services for families, and some small reliance on tax breaks. Now, how that money is spent obviously is going to have an issue on how families can react to it, on who it goes to. Big tax break countries like Germany and France, that proportion of the spending, for instance, will only go to people who pay tax. So people out of the labor market, informal or unemployed, already at the left-hand side of the income distribution, are not benefiting from that 1%, or sorry, 0.5% of tax break. The human services have a different pattern to cash. I mean, intervention through human services can build capacities, whereas cash can have a shorter shelf life, particularly if you're living hand to mouth. Anyway, just some thoughts. If we click on to the next slide. When we looked at the portfolio of policies, at the types of policies this money could be spent on, we've split it up like this: social protection and cash benefits at the top, social and human services, education, care, sports, and family health services. You can see across the top, we've got ages. So it gives us an indication based upon what most countries are doing when they've got a full portfolio, when they start paying what type of benefits for children, what they're spending their money on. Some things are across the life course, like health insurance or accommodation services or universal child benefits, and some are age-related, such as parental leave benefits or birth grants or youth active labor market policies. And that's also got to be figured into how we would expect the portfolio to look like when we look at it at the age spending profile in different countries. It won't just look like Heckman's ski slope, because sometimes life has age-related needs, which should give us little spikes at different points in the picture. So if we click on again, in terms of an example of what a country profile might look like, again from Heckman, this is from prenatal to 18. It's an adaptation of this. He would have the curving slope. But this will help you read more or less how countries are doing in terms of when things start, types of policies start, and how much is spent. The dark color is cash. The mid blue color is in-kind and public work services, accommodation. Childcare and preschool is lighter blue still, and education is the block. So we might want to look at something, we might want to see a profile that looks something like this if we think countries are more or less following the evidence base. So let's click on and look at the first country. So this is what Norway looks like. Note the Y axis that runs up to 45,000 per child at the highest peak, and their investment in children around birth, in support of mothers leaving and fathers, though less time, leaving the labour market to care for infants. They're quick to implement childcare services. There's no gap there. There is a fall, but parents are returning to work, so we would expect that. There is constant human services use. I'm afraid that the colours are wrong in the key. I've just noticed that white is childcare and that mid-blue service is that thin line. That's where things like child protection sits also. And there's the education services. So Norway doesn't look too bad, and you might expect the education services to benefit from the early investment that we see through childcare and supporting family incomes. We click on. This is Argentina. Argentina was one of the examples Natalia shared with you. Not much going on in terms of availability of cash before in relation to the crisis point of birth. There are some benefits available for families, but then when you average it out for a child, there's not a lot of money going into those. There is a family allowance there, preschool services and education, but it's backwards. It's backloaded in comparison to what Norway was doing. That dashed line that you see is what the profile would look like in terms of spending if every child accessed every service. So it would drop, obviously, because it'd be less per capita. But note, we had 45,000 on the y-axis for Norway and now 7 for Argentina. Can we click again? This is Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is a good example for other countries in Eastern Africa and West Africa in the majority, where there's very little spending. Education dominates the picture, and so few children enter into higher education that the investment spent per capita makes it stand out in comparison to everything else. This drives inequality. Only those that survive the system get the big investments. Even if every child got into higher education, that dashed line would show you that the country is investing more per capita at the population level into higher education than any other part of the child system. We click on again. So this is the average high income countries, not quite like Norway, bit more education spending, bit of a gap around age 2, not super efficient. Families are detached from the labor market, don't really get the supports. The spending is high, but certainly lower than Norway. If we click on the same y-axis, this is upper middle income countries. Social protection is almost not there. If we click on again, some preschool and childcare cash benefits very, very low. Early years investment very, very low. Backloaded profile benefiting children in higher education, driving inequality within countries. Click on again. And the same for low income countries. If we just click on one more time, so we can have a look at them all together. Why I say this evidence points towards increasing inequality within and between countries is because when your spending profile increases with age over time, then eligibility and attachment to public services has its own rewards in the next year. More investment for those who can stay in longer. And we all know that the determinants of detachment from school or lack of take-up of services or being able to pick up your cash benefit is because you're already in trouble one way or another. You need to engage in the family's engaging with child labor, they're not able to apply for the benefits and so on. And so within countries, there's difference. And between countries, remember that we've used US dollars PPP. The investment in high income countries is light years ahead. It raises a lot of questions in many ways as to whether the role of foreign assistance is doing enough to catalyze coherent systems of child policy. What we're looking at is essentially a picture, and Lisa said it. The spending outside of high-income countries is chronically too little and always too late. And it doesn't paint a good picture for child well-being and development, certainly not in line with Article 2 of non-discrimination, and certainly suggests to us that social development, the sustainable development goals and broader ambitions to have an equal world, well, we're a long way off profiles that would say that we have a chance of doing that at all. So I would click on, sorry for the sad news, we don't need to see this, it's just comparison on the same chart. There has been changes in OECD countries up to 2009. Unfortunately, we're not looking at Canada on this list because of the lack of education spending, the OECD doesn't calculate per age spending for Canada, so I can't compare. But you can see in most countries, there's been increases in cash, but bigger increases in childcare, and it's now the most popular investment in high-income countries. They're going services. Remember, Canada is busy going cash. We click on. This is just other benefits in kind and education. Now, those of you with the sharpest eyes, we're about to pass on to Dragan, which is great. Those of you with the sharpest eyes will notice there's only one country which falls below the 45-degree line in every chart, and that's the United Kingdom. Pre-COVID, up until 2019, only the United Kingdom saw falls in its investment per capita in every area of child policy. Okay, that's it from me. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Natalia and Dom. It's sobering, the slow burn crisis that we have in children's underinvestment, but also you presented us with some inspiring examples of what countries can achieve even in the most challenging environments. And it starts with being clear about what you're spending, when, for whom, and what those results are. And none of those things are easy to do, but they're possible. So thank you very much for that information. And for our participants, please feel free to begin posting questions that you may have in the chat. We've got about a half hour left, and we're going to now hear from my colleague Dragan Nastic before we get into a conversation. I'd love to give Dragan the warmest welcome I possibly can. He is a longtime friend as well as a colleague. Dragan is the strategic lead for the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child at UNICEF United Kingdom, and a mentor to me for many years. I think you're always a step ahead in terms of what the UK is pursuing in terms of children's rights. Some countries have an abundance of national wealth, but a deficit of political will to make children their priority in public spending. And I think that Dragan has been at the center of progress to change that in the UK and advance children's rights in public budgets. And there's some very exciting developments underway. So Dragan, what can you tell us about what's going on in the UK and how you're elevating children's rights in public investments?
Thank you. As Lisa, Natalia, and Dominic said, child budgeting is an important measure of implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Indeed, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has recognized child budgeting as one of general measures of implementation. And it's in its general comment number 5, it does state that children should be visible in budgets if the convention is to be implemented and if scrutiny of implementation is to be enabled. However, when we look across the world at practice, we can see that it's been rather poor. UNICEF reckons that between the year 2000 and 2015, only 100 child budget analyses had been produced. Moreover, great majority of those budget analyses had been commissioned and organized by non-governmental partners, principally UNICEF and Save the Children. And most of them have been one-off projects. So it's obvious that this particular general measures of implementation is facing its challenges in terms of becoming consistent and sustainable. I hope that my presentation will shed more light on what these challenges are. So I would like to share with you the lessons and experiences from the United Kingdom. But the first thing to say is that I'm not going to talk about the whole of the United Kingdom, because this is a country with a very complex structure. There is the UK itself with 4 nations, England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. There are 3 Crown dependencies and 14 British overseas territories. Moreover, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is not part of the domestic law. The UK government, as a matter of principle in general, keeps international treaties separate from domestic law. Furthermore, the level of decentralization has been very high. Most of the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child are under the jurisdiction of devolved governments, except so-called restricted areas, reserved areas like immigration, defense, and nationality. So because of that, the progress in implementation of the convention has been very uneven across the UK. And that's also very true when it comes to child budgeting. So I'm going to focus today on the situation in Wales, Scotland, and Jersey. Wales has been the most advanced and progressive country in the UK in terms of explicit recognition and implementation of the child rights-based approach. More than 20 years ago, the Welsh Parliament passed a resolution stating that all policy legislation and practice in Wales will be in line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That was then followed by a legislation in 2012 introducing an obligation on the Welsh government and ministers to consider the Convention on the Rights of the Child in everything they do. And one of the instruments for ensuring that happens is a child rights impact assessment. It is not a mandatory tool, but the Welsh officials have been very good in consistently applying child rights impact assessment. And since 2012, the Welsh government has produced and published almost 400 child rights impact assessment on various pieces of policy, legislation, strategies, programs, projects, etc., etc. So it is within that context that the Welsh government has also undertaken child budgeting, and has very much based on that, on the recommendation by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that children should be visible in the budget. And the Welsh government has produced child-sensitive budgets on several occasions. I have singled out some most salient points of time in 2005 and then 2009. and then also later on. In one UNICEF report published in 2016, Wales was represented there as the only example of a high-income country undertaking child budgeting. Indeed, the Welsh government representative who took part at the workshop organized by UNICEF was very proud to say that Wales was, in that time, the only country in the European Union to have attempted a child-focused budget analysis. I have included here a link to that report by UNICEF on child-focused public expenditure measurement. It's a compendium of country initiatives with case studies from all over the world, including Argentina. And as I said, Wales there is the only example of a high-income country. Now, the methodology the Welsh government has used was based on the existing budget expenditure lines. And then the policy and business units across the Welsh government had been tasked to measure which proportion of that particular line had benefited children. And they did it in three ways. One was directly. So this is a line that specifically is aimed at children. So it was assumed that the population group of children benefits 100%. For example of that is food and nutrition in schools. Then indirectly, these are lines aimed at the population in general, where then population breakdown was used to try to assess to what proportion a particular population group benefited from it. Example here would be related to town center regeneration programs. And then the third one was using statistical data in combination with population breakdown. So for instance, in the area of health, because trusts for hospitals on a regional basis, not only that they have population breakdown available, but also statistical data with the exact number of patients with their age. And so through that, they were then able to attribute which particular proportion of the health budget budgetary line was used for children. And then on the basis of that, maps and tables had been produced. I haven't reproduced them here. You can find them in that UNICEF report, a number of tables. Some of most interesting are those that actually show trends across the years, and also where comparison is done between different population groups. This is one of the features of child budgeting that Wales has been undertaking, that although it started with just exclusive child budgets, then they moved on to include other population groups as well. And the government reckons that this has been a very useful exercise. They showed that child rights budget analysis is feasible. Indeed, I didn't want to quote it here, but the Welsh government actually went on to say, contrary to what the UK central government is claiming, and why they are not doing that. And as I said, extending this budget into other age groups has added value. However, it has been noted that it was not clear to what extent these child budgets have actually informed decision making. And there is a sense that in a way that was an exercise done for itself in an isolation. Indeed, the child budgeting work faded away to some extent after 2016. Not that it disappeared, but it has been transformed and it has been merged into an integrated approach to budgeting and forecasting and assessing the impact of budget. Indeed, the Welsh Parliament, after conducting recently an inquiry into the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the recommendation number 1 to the Welsh government was to produce a specific child rights impact assessment on the draft budget. But the Welsh government rejected that recommendation. They replied that they would like to continue with an integrated impact assessment, within which, of course, children are also included. They argued that this holistic approach is better because there might be a risk if producing a child budget in isolation, that unintended consequences could happen in the sense that a positive action for children then might be at the expense of another age group. But the Welsh government did say that they very much continue to apply child right-based approach within this integrated approach, and that they are open to suggestions on how to further strengthen child rights-based approach in their budgetary work. And indeed, a budget improvement plan process has been put in place to further reform the work and productions of future budgets. And there is a budget impact assessment working group to advise on that, and a representative from the child rights sector is also on that advisory group. Moving on to Scotland. Scotland has more powers than Wales, and Scotland has decided to incorporate the convention into Scots law. The bill is now soon to be tabled in the Parliament. That bill introduces a duty on all public authorities to comply with the convention, and not just on all public authorities, but also on the private sector and the voluntary sector when they are contracted to perform a job of public nature. Children and their representatives and everybody else will be able to take a legal action in a court of law against any duty bearer if they think that the convention has been violated. And indeed, the court of law will be able to declare a piece of legislation, a law, incompatible with the convention, and then the Scottish Parliament would be obliged to revise that law. Child rights impact assessment will be mandatory in Scotland for the Scottish government. They will be voluntary for all other duty bearers, but they will be encouraged to conduct child rights impact assessment. And within that, there are also provisions on child budgeting. So the bill itself talks about child budgeting, and there is an obligation on the Scottish government to produce a child rights scheme, which will be a package of proactive measures to enable full implementation of the future law, and the budgetary processes will have to be part of those child rights schemes, setting out the actions to be taken so that child rights are considered in the budget process itself. The work on those implementation tools is actually already underway. And I'd like to mention here two of those strands of work. One is a statutory guidance for public authorities, so a secondary legislation. There is a Scottish Government working group drafting that guidance. UNICEF UK is a member of this group. Child budgeting will be very much there, but it will be more on the top level and introducing principles of the child budgeting. More detailed guidelines on child budgeting will be in the skills and knowledge framework guidance, and that work is already in the parallel. The reason for that is because the templates and the processes for child budgeting will not be unitary and uniform for all duty bearers. There's no one size fits all. So the templates for the central government, for instance, will be much more elaborate and detailed than, for instance, a local authority or a police station, or indeed a voluntary organization that has been contracted. But they will also have to do child budgeting and consider children in everything they do, in order to ensure that the bill is implemented. Otherwise, as I said, they will be facing a legal action. And the last example is from Jersey. I don't know whether you can spot there a white arrow on the satellite map pointing to Jersey. Jersey is a small island very close to France in the channels. It is a crown dependency. It's not a part of the United Kingdom, but it does recognize the sovereignty of the crown, and the UK government is responsible for the defense. But otherwise, Jersey is a self-governing territory with its own parliament and the government. And Jersey has been very progressive in implementing the Convention on the Rights of the Child ever since the ratification was extended to it in 2014. And last year, very much in close collaboration with UNICEF UK, Jersey passed a law incorporating the Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law. It's an indirect incorporation based on the Welsh model, but going much further. Child rights impact assessments are going to be a mandatory for Jersey Parliament and for the government in everything they do for policy and legislation and other key decisions. And the law also specifically says that child rights impact assessment will have to be produced for the budget, or as they call it, the government plan. Other duty bearers, including again private sector and voluntary sector, when contracted to do functions of public nature, will be encouraged and really trained and equipped to do child budgeting and child rights impact assessment. The work on those instruments, guidance, etc., is now underway, and it will all come into force starting from next year, when the first child budgeting analysis is expected to be produced. So I'll finish there. Thank you for your attention, and I very much welcome your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dragan and Natalia and Dom. I think that you're showing us, despite the complexity of budgeting, there are breakthroughs that can happen. There are steps that could be taken to at least begin to make children more visible, and from there to begin to understand if budgets are adequate, if they are fair, and if they actually get results for children. And the big question that we started with, and that countries are obligated to answer, are they investing the maximum extent of their resources in children? Are children a priority in budgets? So thank you so much. And Dom, feel free if you can to turn on your camera. We have some questions and comments that have started to come into the chat, but I also encourage anyone who would like to post one to do that. I don't know if it'll be drinking water from a hose, but I'll try to get to as many as I can. I think there was a question for clarity that Dom was able to answer. Thanks, Dom. You've been answering some questions as we've gone as well, including, yes, the challenges, and I've seen this for years with OECD data, that countries who are federal states like Canada tend not to report, or might underreport based on the division of budget responsibilities. I really hope we can overcome this at some stage, because there was some other discussion in the chat about, the comparability of budgets between countries, and I think UNICEF is known for our approaches to be able to compare countries that are similar, at least based in their wealth, in terms of what they can achieve for children. Some of those results indicators that we can compare ourselves against, like our rates of child poverty. Maybe there's some questions in there that we can pull together, and Dom, I'll ask you to respond to. Does comparing countries, maybe not in the overall spend, which, as someone noted, is a challenge, I guess, to make meaning out of, but certainly in terms of different types of spending and allocations, or even against international targets and commitments that we've committed to, but we don't always budget to fully achieve. How do you see that kind of comparative work motivating countries to actually do more? Is there any evidence that happens based on your work with OECD and UNICEF?
Yeah, I think there is a motivation to harmonize and make possible comparisons, primarily because we're drawing evidence from everywhere now. And when we look at research, our question should always be, well, is this suitable for my context or not? And the only way you can figure that out is if you are able to understand a little bit about the context where the evidence is coming from, and indeed your own context. So, I mean, if I don't know who governs childcare in Denmark and how much is being spent, how much of that can I learn for applicability in Canada? There's a good example between Denmark and France, very similar in terms of their childcare systems. The Danish system has less of an effect on earnings inequality because it has a fees system, progressive universal, whereas French is universal, meaning if I earn $1,000 an hour and you earn $0, I'm going to make much more of 40 hours of childcare than you. So it creates earnings inequality. And so the obvious thing would say, well, France, why don't you change to something that looks like Denmark? Or say there's constitutional issues with that. There are promises of they're centrally managed, whereas it's municipally managed in Denmark. So the local area needs. And so, I mean, essentially, if you don't understand what your neighbors are doing, and you can't speak to that with reassurance of comparability, then you're kind of working in the dark when it comes to cross-national transferable evidence. And OECD is, let's not pretend this is a long history of getting this right. OECD have only been really comparing education expenditure about 96 properly. And full social expenditure data, we're going back to the 80s on social protection. It is all still a bit piecemeal, but we're getting better at it. Next week, we'll have a meeting with with people working in low and middle income countries today. We've got a lot of catching up to do. I don't know whether that's explained anything, but it's hard work. And just to point on something that Liliana raised on federal states, there's only 27 globally, and most of them are doing quite well. I mean, they're not really the poorest countries in the world. There's underreporting because of the types of federalized, and it can vary by sector. And I think the issue with Canada is there's no legal mechanism by which the provinces can be compelled to report to the central government the education expenditure, whereas in other countries they can. And for Brazil, it's a different matter. But it doesn't change the picture, I say, because most of those countries are doing quite well, what we're seeing in low income settings. It just means those federal countries are probably doing a bit better than we think they are right now.
Thanks, John. There's also a question from Carla Valle Painter around and maybe this is for Natalia, and again, I think there's some jurisdictions in the UK that are linking child rights lenses with future generations considerations. I think there's a future generations commissioner, is it in Wales? But linking that to child budgeting, is there, for instance, do you see future generations' rights and needs being built in? I think certainly with debt servicing, that's a consideration. If you can have a look at the chat in that question, maybe I'll ask Natalia if you've got any responses to that question. The inclusion of future generation lenses as part of child budgeting, have you ever seen that in your work?
I mean, very much echoing the first part of the question, right? Around, how much we've been trying to enhance our analysis around the climate crisis. It also is a child rights crisis. The extent to which children have been impacted now, but more importantly, to the extent to which, the future adults and adolescents are the ones that are going to bear the highest costs, as well as the inequity elements, like who is generating emissions and who is paying the cost around different elements and the investment that they need to make in terms of adaptation and making systems more equitable. I think the latest note that DOMS and the team did in terms of the cost of climate and social sectors is a key part of what we were trying to also make very clear, that we're talking a lot about climate financing and the importance of making systems more resilient, but that is not necessarily always systematically integrated in how we finance and budget social sectors. So when we think about, we need to expand social protection, for example, we think about coverage, we talk about adding more vulnerable populations, but we're not thinking about, we also need to make the systems more risk informed, shock responsive, better prepared, and what are the extra costs in making sure that we have a better system in those elements, right? And I think UNICEF have been trying to make the case of the importance and the added value of having risk-informed systems, but also the need to have very specific financing mechanisms or contingency funds to allow for that better response to happen in a very preparedness element. We also had with the Lancet Commission a discussion around intergenerational investments and the importance of not, competing between generations, critical investment case around investing in early years in ECD and children and the impacts that have on future generations. So I think we need to bring those very different pieces together and continue to strengthen the case. I think that even though there are gaps in evidence and there's a gap of analysis across the board, I do think that it's more of a advocacy and voice and the work that we need to continue doing in making sure that these types of evidence are available in very timely moments of policy decision. I don't think that decisions or limited policy change is not there, not because of lack of evidence, but of the effective use of that evidence and having critical champions in policy, in decision making places to make sure that those changes are made and that the right things are prioritized. And I think that brings me a little bit to what we've been trying to do in terms of voice and agency. I think it was very clear in the context of COVID-19 that the fact that there was a slight changing narrative and around social protection. For many years, social protection has been seen as only important for the poorest, for the marginalized, from the extreme poor, a handout. But COVID changed that narrative, or started to change that narrative, because it was important for everybody, for those in the middle class, for those in the service sector, for those that lost employment, and therefore a much more bigger push for unemployment benefits, for care support, for other types of income support. And I think that's where a little bit our role as UNICEF and partners is critical in enhancing the voice of children that sometimes are not able to vote, are not able to be in the most influential parts of decision making, and putting very clearly that that investment in their rights it has an impact in their well-being, but also across communities. So I think the evidence is important, but also that a very strong political participation in spaces to make sure that the voices are heard and we can influence key policy decisions.
Thanks, Natalia. I think given that we're out of time, I'll just close, and reflect something that Dom said earlier. Future generations really begin with children, right? What we do in childhood is the future of human development and the basis on which future generations will rise. And so thank you. I think we've made the case very well today that there's more work to be done. And I want to thank everyone for their questions and comments. Our presenters, our co-hosts, McGill University and the Canadian Wellbeing Knowledges Network. I've posted the next webinar coming up in our spring festival of webinars on budgeting and results for people that make us well and secure our rights. So thank you very much, everyone, for this rich discussion and planting the seeds of so many ideas and the compulsion to do better for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, colleagues. Until the next one.
Lisa. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.